You've probably heard of big screen figures like Leatherface, Buffalo Bill, and Norman Bates. Behind them is a man who actually existed and was responsible for the deaths of people in a totally awful way. But how did a small-town nobody become the inspiration for some of the greatest villains in cinema history? Today, we're going to dive into the mind of Ed Gein, the Butcher of Plainfield. So hit that like button, subscribe, and get ready to travel to the darkest side of human nature, because you won't be able to forget, and might even have nightmares after watching this video. Picture this. It's rural Wisconsin, mid-50s, a quiet place where everyone knows everyone. And there, in the middle of nowhere, is an isolated farm. Living on it is a guy who, at first glance, seems harmless, a bit weird, a little shy, but trustworthy enough to babysit and be a handyman, helping neighbors with their crops, a handyman nobody would really pay much attention to. His name? Edward Theodore Gein. Behind that strange country bumpkin facade, he hid an absurdly sick secret. In November of 1957, the Plainfield police, a small town that had never seen anything beyond harvests and church gossip, decide to check out this guy's house. And what they find inside, dude, it's mind-blowing. Human skulls used as bowls, human skin turned into lampshades, chairs upholstered with human skin, and the worst part, a complete suit made of woman's skin. Yes, you heard that right, a human skin suit. This isn't a horror movie script. It's not an urban legend. It's the true story of Ed Gein, the Butcher of Plainfield. Edward Theodore Gein, born on August 27, 1906, in La Crosse, Wisconsin. But before becoming this macabre legend, Ed was just a kid in an environment that, let's be real, was a living hell on earth. His childhood was a toxic mix of isolation, religious fanaticism, and a problematic family dynamic. His mother, Augusta Wilhelmine Gein, was a central figure in this tragedy. A domineering woman with a religious faith that bordered on fanaticism, she instilled in her sons, Ed and his older brother, Henry, the belief that the outside world was a pit of sin, an immoral place, and that all women, except herself, were prostitutes and instruments of the devil. Can you imagine growing up hearing that? What kind of worldview do you build with that kind of brainwashing? His father, George Gein, was an abusive alcoholic who couldn't hold a job and, consequently, was despised by Augusta. This situation led Augusta to become the family's main provider, which, ironically, further increased her son's emotional dependence on her. It's like the perfect recipe for disaster, you know? Ed and Henry lived in isolation, without friends, under the iron grip of this woman. Ed's relationship with his mother was sick, to say the least. It wasn't just a mother-son relationship, it was something much deeper and more disturbing. Criminal psychology experts, when analyzing Gein's case, often point to the Oedipus complex, an unconscious sexual and romantic attraction to the mother, accompanied by rivalry with the father. This concept is a normal phase in children between 3 and 6 years old, but obviously, that wasn't the case here. And Augusta, instead of curbing it, kind of fed this dependence. She despised her children's father and saw in them a kind of exclusive companionship, a refuge from her own marital unhappiness. She kept them close, away from any external influence that could corrupt them. The isolated farm in Plainfield, where the family moved in 1914, when Ed was 8 years old, under the pretext of escaping the city's immorality, only intensified this unhealthy dynamic. Ed was a shy kid, and while other kids went to school and played, Ed stayed home, helping with manual labor and listening to sermons about sin and punishment. His mother kept repeating that all women were prostitutes, to instill fear and guilt. This shaped a quiet, weird dude who, instead of making friends, became fascinated by his own mother and by death. He had a problem with his left eye that gave him a lazy eye, which made him a target for bullying at school. His mother, instead of protecting him, severely punished him for trying to make friends, further reinforcing his social isolation. He was a good reader, an average student, but his social development was practically non-existent. Can you imagine the impact of that on a teenager's psyche? At 14, he dropped out of school, becoming an avid reader but even more reclusive. In 1927, at 21 years old, Augusta made her 2 sons promise to remain virgins, a vow that Ed, apparently, took seriously his entire life. With his father's death in 1940, at 66 years old, from heart failure caused by alcoholism, the family dynamic changed. Henry, Ed's brother, who was already 39, began openly criticizing their mother and worrying about Ed's unhealthy attachment to her. Henry was trying to break free from Augusta's control, and this caused conflicts. In 1944, Henry died under mysterious circumstances during a farm fire. Although the official cause was asphyxiation, there were contusions on his head, and the police, surprisingly, ruled out foul play, not believing Ed was capable of murder. However, some biographers and investigators strongly suspect Ed may have been involved in his brother's death. After all, Henry was becoming an obstacle to Ed's exclusive relationship with their mother. After Henry's death, Augusta suffered 2 strokes, and Ed dedicated himself to caring for her, having her, as he himself said, all to himself. That phrase, by itself, is chilling, right? When Augusta finally died on December 29th, 1945, Ed was completely devastated. He lost the only person who, in some way, gave meaning to his distorted existence. His reaction was bizarre. He boarded up his mother's bedroom and living room, turning them into a sanctuary, a macabre museum. Does that remind you of anyone? The real-life Norman Bates kept the rest of the house a garbage, but his mother's room remained untouched, immaculate, as if she were still there. From that moment on, driven by overwhelming loneliness and the strange visions he claimed to have, Ed began visiting the cemetery where his mother was buried. He became interested in popular magazines about cannibals and Nazi atrocities, and in books about human anatomy and head shrinking. His mind, already fragile and distorted, was in a very, very dark place. Starting in 1947, Ed Gein's weirdness reached a new level. He began researching obituaries of middle-aged women, waited for the burial, and at night, under the cloak of darkness, he would go there to dig up bodies and exhume corpses in local cemeteries. At least 9 bodies were desecrated, including that of his own mother, Augusta. The motivation? He confessed that he wanted to sew a woman's suit to become his mother. He claimed that the body parts he collected were not enough to satisfy his obsession. It's something that makes you question human sanity, the thin line between life and death, and how the mind can twist to seek in desecration a way to fill an existential void. He didn't have sexual relations with the bodies, but his actions fit perfectly into necrophilia, which is sexual attraction to corpses, even without direct physical contact. But Ed Gein's madness didn't stop there. From grave robber, he became a killer. In 1954, he killed Mary Hogan, the owner of a tavern in Plainfield. Mary resembled his mother, but had a personality he considered dirty, a complicated life story, which led him to shoot her. 3 years later, on November 16, 1957, it was Bernice Worden's turn, the owner of a hardware store. Bernice's murder led to his downfall. Bernice's son, Frank Worden, found the store empty and blood on the floor. He informed the police that Ed Gein had been in the store the day before and asked about the price of antifreeze. The police traced the receipt found in her store back to Ed Gein, and what they found on his farm. Holy cow! It was something that shocked even the most experienced police officers and investigators. The discovery of Ed Gein's horror farm was not just the resolution of a missing persons case. It was the opening of a door to a terror that no one in Plainfield, or perhaps the world, could have imagined until then. Ed Gein's house, that isolated farm I mentioned earlier, was a true museum of horrors, a scene worthy of the worst nightmares. When Sheriff Schley and Deputy Worden entered the property, they found Bernice Worden's headless body hanging upside down in the shed, eviscerated and dressed like a deer. But that was just the tip of the iceberg. Inside the house, the scene was even more grotesque. Human skulls used as bowls, human skin turned into lampshades, chairs upholstered with human skin, and the infamous woman's suit made of skin, complete with breasts. He dismembered, eviscerated, and used body parts to create these macabre objects. The police found human skulls affixed to Ed's bedposts, a box of organs, furniture made of bone and skin, and masks made from the skin of his victims' faces. It's a level that makes you question the very nature of evil. He denied having sexual relations with the corpses, claiming they smelled too bad, but his actions fit perfectly into necrophilia, a paraphilia characterized by sexual attraction to corpses. In addition to the murders of Mary Hogan and Bernice Worden, he was also a suspect in the disappearance of a teenager, Evelyn Hartley, in 1953. Evelyn, just 15 years old, was kidnapped while babysitting for family friends. Signs of a struggle, broken glasses, bloodstains, and footprints were found, but her body was never recovered. It is strongly believed that Ed Gein was responsible for this crime. Gein's house was a literal reflection of his sick mind, a place where death and perversion became artifacts of an uncontrollable obsession. From a psychological standpoint, Ed Gein was diagnosed with schizophrenia and sexual psychopathy. It's important to note that, in the 1950s, the tools and knowledge about mental health were much more limited than today. Forensic psychiatrist Carol Lieberman suggests that extreme isolation and his relationship with his mother were crucial for the development of his psychopathology. Gein's schizophrenia may have contributed to his deep loneliness and to the voices he heard, which, according to him, compelled him to seek a new mother. Schoolmates remembered his random, seemingly motiveless laughter, which may indicate auditory hallucinations, a common symptom of schizophrenia. Psychologists stated that Gein probably dealt with several very disturbed psychopathologies, that he was psychotic, suffering from a delusional disorder that left him out of touch with reality. Ed was skilled with knives, saws, and any butcher's tool. He knew how to clean bones without breaking them, sew strips of skin, and prepare macabre instruments. These skills demonstrate that he wasn't a clumsy psychopath, There was method and organization in every piece he crafted. However, he wasn't an evil genius, but a deeply disturbed man, considered an individual with limited technical and mental abilities, but an avid reader and capable of performing handyman and babysitting tasks, being considered trustworthy by the community before the discovery of his crimes. The relationship with his mother was important in the development of mental illnesses, but not their sole cause. In the end, Ed Gein left a legacy of terror that echoes to this day. He was declared legally insane and, on January 6, 1958, was committed to Central State Hospital indefinitely. Gein's farm, the scene of so many horrors, was scheduled for auction in March of 1958, but, ironically, it was destroyed by a mysterious fire in the early morning hours. Ed Gein spent 10 years institutionalized, until, on January 22, 1968, at 62 years old, he was deemed competent to stand trial. The legal process was long, taking 9 months just for preliminary matters. The trial itself lasted 1 week. On November 7, 1968, Ed Gein was found guilty of first-degree murder for the death of Bernice Worden. However, the court also concluded that, on the day of the crime, he was not sane. For this reason, he was declared not guilty by reason of insanity and immediately sent back to Central State Hospital, where he remained for the rest of his life. In 1974, he unsuccessfully attempted a petition claiming to have recovered his mental health, but it was rejected and he was returned to the hospital. In 1978, he was transferred to the Mendota Mental Institute in Madison. He was considered by many at the hospital a model patient, mild-mannered and always helpful. On July 26, 1984, at 78 years old, Ed Gein passed away at the Mendota Mental Institute in Wisconsin. The cause of death was respiratory and cardiac failure. After a long battle with cancer, he was buried next to his mother in Plainfield Cemetery, an ending that, in a way, sealed the cycle of his sick obsession. Ed Gein was considered by many the father of all modern serial killers. Several subsequent murderers cited the Gein case as inspiration for their crimes. His impact on pop culture is, without a doubt, also visible and huge. He became the inspiration for some of the most iconic and terrifying villains in horror cinema, being called the unhealthy relationship with his mother, the isolated house, the room preserved as a sanctuary, the personality split between the submissive son and the brutal killer was the inspiration for Norman Bates from the movie Psycho. And what about Leatherface from the Texas Chainsaw Massacre? The idea of a killer who wears human skin masks, who decorates his house with bones and furniture made of human remains, is a blatant copy of the findings on the Plainfield farm. The brutality, the dehumanization of victims, the atmosphere of rural horror, all directly refer to Gein's legacy. Even the disturbing Buffalo Bill from The Silence of the Lambs, who wanted to make a woman's suit out of human skin to transform into a woman, is a direct reference to Gein. The psychological complexity, the search for identity through mutilation, and the appropriation of another's body are themes that echo Ed Gein's distorted mind. It's important to note that some stories about Gein are pure fiction, such as the alleged inspiration from Nazi Ilse Koch or his involvement in the capture of Ted Bundy. However, his legacy as the Butcher of Plainfield and the grotesque nature of his acts have immortalized him as one of the most influential serial killers in history, shaping how horror is told to this day and making us question the limits of human cruelty and mental sanity. Netflix dropped the 3rd season of its acclaimed, and at times controversial, anthology series, Monster, The Ed Gein Story, on October 3, 2025. This new iteration follows the success of previously told stories, like Dahmer and Lyle and Eric Menendez's story, solidifying Ryan Murphy and Ian Brennan's brand, known for their distinctive visual style and narratives that delve into the psychological complexities of their characters. An interesting aspect of the production is the inclusion of characters that transcend Gein's direct story to address its cultural impact, illustrating how the legend of Ed Gein was absorbed, reinterpreted, and at times, glamorized by Hollywood. However, for me, the attempt to explain his crimes and humanize them ultimately diminishes the impact of the cases, especially for those who suffered directly from them. The inclusion of fictional elements, poorly explained, is dangerous. This embellishment of the story is what makes it more fantastical, potentially stripping it of the seriousness with which it should be treated. In other words, it puts the wrong viewpoint in the spotlight and shows how society and the entertainment industry display and perpetuate their acts and memory, sometimes without responsibility. Ed Gein, the Butcher of Plainfield, was a product of an abusive childhood, extreme isolation, and severe mental illness. He wasn't a monster born out of nowhere, a demon from hell. He was shaped by circumstances that led him to commit brutal acts. And honestly, it makes me wonder, with today's knowledge and resources, could we have prevented this tragedy? Do you think someone is born with this murderous nature, or is it all a product of their environment? Would he still have become the monster we know? Leave your opinion in the comments. I really want to know what you guys think about this. If you dug this journey into Ed Gein's mind, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Share it with your friends who are into true crime and horror fans. I'll catch you next time.